Hey everyone, welcome back as Limited Review Week continues here on my channel. The last couple days we've looked at the best commons and uncommons in white and black, and today we move on to blue. Before we get started with my picks, let me remind you guys to enter my Eldritch Moon draft giveaway if you haven't already. An annotation should have just appeared to guide you there, and it should also be in the description if you're watching this on a phone or whatever where you can't see annotations. Alright, so let's get started with the best uncommons in blue. I think the best uncommon in blue is Advanced Stitchwing, and I think that's kind of sad. I think blue in general is kind of underpowered. That's kind of what making this list showed me, trying to find both the best uncommons and the best commons. I wasn't like super amazed with any of them. Usually the best uncommon in a color is a card that is unequivocally first pickable. I don't think Advanced Stitchwing is that. It's a fine card. It's nothing super exciting, though. If it weren't the best blue uncommon, I wouldn't be talking bad about it at all because it is a solid card. Because for 5 mana, you get a 3/4 flyer, which is about on rate. It's probably like a C+ on the vanilla test. Sometimes you get 5 mana 4/4 flyers, especially in white or blue, but he's almost there, so he's not the worst at the vanilla test. But on top of that, he has a very useful ability, and that is that he can always come back from your graveyard, provided you have 2 cards in your hand and 3 mana. And that's a lot like a card, and actually the card I said was the best blue uncommon in Shadows over Innistrad, Stitchwing Scob. Obviously, this is sort of the next stage in evolution for that card based on its flavor text and everything. So it still has the same amount of power, but it has a lot more toughness, and that was definitely Stitchwing Scob's downside. The Stitchwing Scob costs 1 less for a 3/1 flyer, also flying, and it also costs 1 less to bring back from your graveyard. But I think it's probably worth the extra investment to get an extra 3 toughness. 1 toughness just can't swing through spirit tokens and things like that, and Advanced Stitchwing can do that just fine. In a format that's so focused on the graveyard, Advanced Stitchwing has some advantages as well. Helps you activate Madness, helps you get to Delirium, and those are both good things, in addition to other graveyard-related value shenanigans that are around in the format. It also has a useful creature type, that is zombie, and there are zombie synergies in this draft format, so that's important as well. Because blue, I think, is sort of so shallow and uncommon, I did want to mention a few other uncommons that I think are good, but I don't think are better than Advanced Stitchwing. I could be wrong. All of them are just sort of mad at me, though. I mean, yeah, I'd play all of them, but none of them are things that I'm really excited about. None of them are first pickable, basically. So let's go ahead and talk about these 3 cards. The first of these is Unsubstantiate, a pretty good uncommon. I think it will be a lot better in Constructed, though, than it is in Limited, but the flexibility that it allows you is still pretty good. Being able to, for example, return your opponent's 6 or 7 drop to their hand when they cast it, meaning you don't have to worry about end of the battlefield abilities. It's a pretty big tempo swing, especially if it's a card with the Emerge. Then it's just amazing. You can also use it to stop a removal spell that would have saved your opponent, but that's really only true if the removal spell is expensive enough. Of course, you could also bounce your own creature with Unsubstantiate to save it. Basically, the card does a lot, but none of it is ultra exciting, and cards like it that we've seen before, such as Disperse, have been cards you feel fine about having in your deck, but not overly excited. And don't get me wrong, this is probably a little better than Disperse, even though Disperse can bounce any permanent, Unsubstantiate can bounce any spell, and so it's probably a little bit better than Disperse, but it's not a lot better, at least in Limited. Obviously, again, in Constructed, it's going to be very good. It's going to show up in Standard and so forth. The next card I had initially as my best uncommon in the set, actually, not in the set, in blue, in Nebelgast Herald. A 3 mana 2/1 flyer with Flash is already a playable card, a card you're happy to have. On top of that, when it comes into play, it taps a creature your opponent controls, so you can stop their best attacker, stop their best blocker, and make sure you get some value out of your Herald in addition to it being an efficient-bodied flyer. On top of that, it does that anytime you play a spirit, but it's important to note most of your other spirits won't have Flash unless you're lucky enough to also have Rattle Chains or something like that. So you're not going to be able to tap them at instant speed, which is obviously the ideal thing to do if you can with Nebelgast Herald. So that means after he's in play most of the time, again, your cards aren't going to have Flash, so you'll only be able to tap things down when you're attacking, and they won't be really able to do anything to stop your opponent from attacking you. But the blue deck, especially the Blue-White Skies deck, that's also a Spirit deck, which this is really a card for, tapping down 1 creature, especially if it's a flyer, can just mean it wins you the game as well. I think the Herald is quite good. And I could see it ending up being the best blue uncommon, but it's also, again, unexciting, just like Advanced Stitchwing and Unsubstantiate. And now the last of these cards I want to talk about is Vexing Scuttler. I will admit cards with Emerge are not the easiest thing to evaluate. We've never seen anything exactly like this. The patrons from back in Kamigawa block had sort of a similar ability. So it's hard to evaluate. Most of the time when I see Emerge, I don't like it a whole lot, mostly because I think about value a lot. That's a big key to Limited, is just making sure you use fewer cards than your opponent does to do the same things or more. And Vexing, Emerge makes you sacrifice something, but Vexing Scuttler kind of corrects for the fact that you have to sacrifice a creature because it gives you a card back, and it gives you back an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. And that's pretty relevant. I mean, usually the instants and sorcery cards in your deck are going to be pretty powerful. They're going to be removal spells. Getting them back and getting a 4 or 5 creature is pretty good. You obviously don't want to be paying the full 8 to do it, but if you can sacrifice like a 2-drop who's become irrelevant on the board and play this thing on turn 4, play this thing on turn 5. A 5-mana 4/5 with that ability is something you play every time. And I don't think that's really like a crazy world situation. Vexing Scuttler, another one I could see ending up being the best uncommon. It's just hard to see how Emerge is going to shake out in the format. So from there, we're going to move to the best commons. And at number 3 for the best blue commons, I have Tattered Hunter. Well, like I said, blue isn't super deep at anything really. None of the commons, most of the commons I should say, aren't super exciting. Anytime the third best common, which just usually happens with one color every time I do a limited review, is a card where I'm like, yeah, I mean, I guess I'd play that. I know that it's not going to be the deepest color, especially because in this case the uncommons kind of feel the same way. Tattered Hunter, I mean, is a fine card. It's a spirit, has a relevant creature type for a relevant archetype in the format, the blue-white deck. And it's also a good, efficient early beater, a 2-mana 2/1. And unlike some of these we've seen in the past, instead of not being able to block anything, it can at least block creatures with flying, so that's nice. But there's not really much else to say about it. It's a nice, efficient early beater. The reason it's better than your average 2-mana 2/1 is because it has an evasive ability, and that means it can also be relevant in the later part of some games. Some decks, like red-green, just aren't going to have very many flyers. Now, they might have some creatures with reach, but that's a whole other thing. So Tattered Hunter is, a solid card. I mean, I'm thinking any blue deck in their 2-drop slot is going to be happy to have 1 or 2 of these, but it's not exactly a card you want to be taking early. You can get it in the middle of a pack pretty easily, I would think, maybe even later. So the second best common is one I'm a little higher on, and that is Ingenious Scob. It's a lot like Watercourser, a card we saw in Magic Origins. That was the same card with a different creature type and without the word prowess on it. Now, the addition of a relevant creature type, which is zombie, which is the blue-black sort of tribal element, is that it's a zombie deck, makes Ingenious Scob a little bit better than Watercourser was. It didn't have a relevant creature type. There weren't really any in Magic Origins. Oh, I guess there were elves, but you get my point. It wasn't a tribal set on the whole. And additionally, it's also got Prowess, which makes it a lot better. Prowess plus the +1/-1 ability that Watercourser also had is pretty good. There's some nice synergy there. And Prowess in general has just turned out to be a pretty strong ability. The blue-red spells deck was pretty good in Shadows over Innistrad. I think it's still going to be good in Eldritch Moon. And I think Ingenious Scob is going to slide right into that deck really happily and be a pretty great blue creature. Once again, you don't want to be taking this super early, but I definitely would take it earlier than Tattered Hunter. It's good in any blue deck. If the fail case is Watercourser, which was a playable, if not amazing card, more Tattered Hunter's sort of realm is probably where Watercourser was. If the fail case is that it's going to be Watercourser, there's not really a reason people will avoid picking up this card, although obviously it's at its best in a deck with lots of spells or with zombies or with both. So that's what I think the second best common is in blue. At number 1, I have Drag Under. Now, blue didn't really get a premium removal spell. I think maybe they tried to give it one, and that's something I'll talk about in a moment. I'm going to talk about a couple other commons after I talk about these top 3. But Drag Under is the closest you get, and I mean, it's good. I don't love it a whole lot either, though. I don't love any of these 3 cards. But, the thing that's great about it is it replaces itself. You do have to do it at sorcery speed, so it's missing the instant speedness that most bounce spells have that allows you to get a bigger tempo advantage. But if you're casting Drag Under on your opponent's 6 or 7 mana creature, again, especially something that has Emerge, although that might not be the best idea because then they get their trigger again theoretically. But if you're bouncing something that's 5, 6 mana with Drag Under and you're replacing your Drag Under with the fact that it draws a card, you're definitely getting a tempo advantage, even if you're not going to get to do as much on your own turn. I think Drag Under is a card that any blue deck would probably feel fine about having at least 2 of. and I think that means it's a pretty high-ranked common. I think that's true of Ingenious Scob as well, and probably Tattered Hunter. Like, all three of these are cards that slide into any blue deck. You're happy to have two of each in most any blue deck. That's not a bad core to have a deck be built around. Well, it's not really built around, but, you know, that's the foundation of your deck, let's say. There are a couple other commons I want to talk about because, again, blue, not super deep at commons. I don't think there's a huge gap between, let's say, the third best common and the next two cards I'm going to talk about. And those two cards are Wretched Gryph and Spontaneous Mutation. I think Wretched Gryph has a chance to break into my top three commons. Again, I'm not ultra confident in evaluating Emerge, but the more I think about it and talk about it, like when I'm making these videos, the more I realize that it can be pretty powerful. Wretched Gryph is kind of a bad Mulldrifter, and obviously it's not quite Mulldrifter, but even a bad Mulldrifter is probably a pretty good card, and I think that's the case here. This card's failed case of paying 7 for a 3/4 flyer who draws you a card is mediocre at best, but at least if you draw it in the later part of the game and you don't really want to have to sacrifice anything, it still does something while replacing itself and giving you a decent body. But if you can take advantage of Emerge, which I think blue, and especially blue-green, which is something I'll talk about more in my archetype video, I think that blue, the color blue, can take advantage of Emerge to a certain degree, again, especially paired with green. And that makes Wretched Gryph even better. Imagine playing a creature on turn 2 that maybe gets in for 2 or 4 damage, and it quickly gets overmatched on the board. Say your opponent has good blockers or whatever, and sacrificing it on turn 4 to play this guy also draws you a card. So that means you played a 4-mana 3/4 with flying. You did have to lose a card on the board, but it replaces itself by drawing you a card. That's not bad. I mean, the creatures are going to become less relevant. There's even, the enchantment-based removal that's in the format gets a little worse with the introduction of Emerge, because you can just sacrifice whatever your opponent stuck the enchantment-based removal on, and that's something that's cool about Wretched Gryph. And so I think it has a real chance to be in the top 3 commons once this format really shakes out, once we all play it. And the other card is Spontaneous Mutation. It's another one I'm not 100% certain about. I think that in the right deck it's going to be pretty good. The fact that it has Flash makes it interesting, and it's only 1 mana. So that means it's a very cheap blue combat trick in a way, which blue doesn't usually get. And on top of that, in a deck that can really fill up its graveyard, which I think blue is actually more capable of doing in this format than it was in Triple Shadows over Innistrad. When a deck can fill up its graveyard, it gets to be even better. It can just shut down creatures for a very efficient cost, and it's an effect that gets more and more pronounced the longer the game goes on, basically. Now, I do think the card has to have the right niche to really be playable. If this were a format where everyone always had 3 or 4 cards in their graveyard, basically at all times, and Spontaneous Mutation would be a top 3 common. And this format isn't quite that. You are going to have cards in your graveyard, but it's not always going to be the case. And sometimes Spontaneous Mutation will just be bad and not the best card. And I mean, even if you have everything going the way you want to, you can't get rid of your opponent's creature's toughness, which sometimes is what you need to do. And Spontaneous Mutation doesn't let you do that. But it is a solid card. I think it'll see play in a fair amount of decks. So that does it for my picks for the best blue commons and uncommons. What do you think are the best common and uncommon blue cards in this format? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.